So what's the one thing we hear a lot of in the news lately? It's aliens, 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 right? Ever since I was a child, Hollywood has been busy filling us with all kinds of ideas and images and myths about aliens, extraterrestrials, right? And boy, has that been a hot subject for the last year or so as Pluto has begun its flirtations with the edges of Aquarius. And as we've spoken about technology, this as being a huge issue during this time. For some reason, aliens seem to be on everyone's mind too. We can look back through history and look back through ancient scripture to see pretty quickly that aliens are nothing new to the human experience. We may have a different name for things these days than the ghouls, goblins, fairies, demons, angels, gnomes, leprechauns, and the like of history. We may have a different name for things and maybe even some different pictures and images archetypically in our minds and in our culture. But so-called otherworldly entities and beings are nothing new to the human experience. And if we are to consider the overarching big picture of this Aquarian age that we are moving into, and Pluto's involvement in it particularly for the next 20 years as it makes its way through that area of the sky, and what it involves, and as we've spoken about technology being a very big issue in that regard. Considering technology and considering the media, and these are two subjects that have been dealt with to some extent during this series thus far. Moving slow here because this is a delicate topic. A lot of the subtopics in this area are. So we need to tread carefully. So our culture has grown up with this term extraterrestrial, which broken down literally just means not of the earth or away from the land. Terroir, terra, is earth, land. A quite popular understanding in the spiritual community and an understanding that I tend to agree with is that what we are dealing with, if we are dealing with anything at all, and I believe that we are, when it comes to these other beings, it's impossible for human history to be so full of this and all of its stories and all of its scriptures and all of its myths and legends and history. The talk of such beings, contact with such beings, dreams and thoughts and conversations with such beings. This popular notion in the spiritual community that what we are dealing with is not extraterrestrial at all, not E.T. at all, but E.D., extra-dimensional, spiritual, that these so-called E.T., E.D. beings that make contact with humanity throughout its history in one way or another, and are involved with it in one way or another, or seem to be, more than likely are representing forces in a different dimension than the so-called third dimension where we reside most of the time during our waking hours. The physical flesh, earth life, is three-dimensional. And science has already proven that dimensionality goes beyond 12. So we know that there's more going on than just three. And these so-called beings seem to come from those dimensions. And there are lower dimensions and there are higher dimensions. Anything that is not of the 3D, of the earth, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, could be considered an extra-dimensional being, if you will. In which case we would describe it as spiritual on a level, which is not to say necessarily that it is a higher being, but a different kind of being. Maybe that's An even better way to describe these beings is extra different. ED for extra different. It's even too much of a stretch maybe to say that they're from another dimension or they're from another planet or another star, because we can't physically prove these things. We simply can't. Extra different. E.D.s. Extra different. But I can go with the extra dimensional because I know that to be true in my being. Certainly know it to be more true in my being than this idea of them being extraterrestrial. Just something that came down here visiting. And I mentioned the media earlier and the power structure. And we've talked some about that throughout the series. And when we take a close look at the history of human contact with such beings and human relation with such beings, and we look at the goings on with the alphabet media during our current times and all the hoopla and propaganda around this idea of aliens, it's not hard to draw a conclusion or a theory or a hypothesis, if you will, that these extra dimensional beings themselves are somehow involved in the power structures of the world itself. So-called non-human forces, if you will. This is a common theory among many around the world, that what St. Paul was talking about in his letters about the powers and principalities, the forces of darkness and places of power in the world, the spiritual battle that we live in, that in fact what he was referring to, at least in part, was a spiritual force that it comes from another dimension other than our own, and that they have power, control, and influence over certain groups of minions in the human family that do their bidding. And this is how the power structure and the institutions of the modern world operate. They operate through a top-down, extra-dimensional force. And when I mentioned in, I believe it was part 7, about the technocracy, I hinted at this. I hinted at this notion of there is a faction of what's going on in the world that is unknown to us. These forces that have their finger on the pulse of the technocracy are unknown to us. And perhaps they are unknown to us because, in fact, they are spiritual and extra-dimensional on some level and in some, or to some ratio. They are that. This is a powerful and very popular theory these days as we enter the Pluto into Aquarius period, which marks a grand landmark of the cycle. Some astrologers even go as far to say that it literally marks the official beginning of the age of Aquarius itself, is Pluto's entrance into Aquarius in 2023, 2024, and 2025, calendar year, Gregorian calendar years. And could it be, and I'll close with this, so I don't meander all night on such a subject because we could go down several rabbit holes. And could it be that those powers, those very powers, which we know are in control and ownership of the mainstream media, could it be that they are trying to convince us that aliens are nothing more than physical space creatures that fly in on ships into our physical realm and are not spiritual beings at all? In other words, trying to hoodwink us away from the true understanding of what's happening so that we can't properly deal with it and properly face it, properly confront it. And this idea that a spaceship war is coming, that an alien invasion is coming, and it's going to be a physical thing. Whereas many of us are pretty convinced that it's not a physical thing at all. This is a spiritual one. And where those so-called extra-dimensional spiritual beings might have their power and control over us is because we are not aware of that. We don't understand what they are. And if we begin to understand what they are, then we can confront it. And perhaps those forces themselves, through the media, are trying to convince us otherwise. And ever since I was a kid, I've been seeing pictures of so-called aliens, so-called extraterrestrials, right? What is it they're trying to tell us? Do we need to start with the opposite of what they tell us? Start from there. Maybe an E.T. is an E.D. An extra different.